want to introduce yourself and then maybe introduce the book a little?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Greg McAllister, and I just finished publishing Salvation of a Serial Celibate, which is my memoir for the last 72 years.
I noticed it says a true story on the front. At one point in time, they might have called it a novel, or then, as you say, a memoir now. But is it all truth? Is there any fiction woven into it?
It's all truth, even though, as I read it, part of it feels like it's fiction, but it's all true.
Even from the get-go, reading it, there's kind of a levity to it that I appreciated. Is there? I don't know. Is that just the time that's aided in that perspective, or was it always going to have a humorous twist to it?
Yeah, I think part of what it's about is my evolution with God, and I evolved to the point where I realized that humor was basically the basis of faith. You know, that we see each other or ourselves as very finite in the face of infinity, and that's pretty funny, you know, if you have a right attitude, I think. And I basically wrote it for my kids because I realized that, you know, there was no way they could really appreciate what a radical difference the world today is from the world I grew up in. I mean, I grew up not that long ago. I mean, I'm not that old, but I was old as a kid because I was an only child. I had older parents. My grandparents lived with me. My grandmother was a very big influence on my life. We were best friends. And she was old school Irish Catholic. So I grew up with this religious programming that I just took for granted. I figured everybody had that. And the process of deprogramming myself over the years, I guess is what the book's about. Basically, the program was kind of inherited from the Manichaean tradition, which held that there's the spirit and there's the body. And the spirit is good and the body is evil. And so the spirit's trapped in this body, and the only way that you can release the spirit is by punishing the body or, you know, denying the body. So we were taught, or I was raised to deny emotions, to deny sex especially. Anything that had to do with sex was evil. You know, and sin was the big thing. So you were raised constantly worrying about sin and punishment and the next life. This life was, you know, I mean, I was raised to be ready for heaven. Living this life was the hard part. So that's what I wanted to explain to my kids, you know, just what this strange world was that their father came from.
A piece you did for BCTV that documented some of your time in the seminary centered around a reunion. I guess I was trying to get at something with some of the other people that went through seminary school with you that have now, you've had a chance to talk with as well, if there's kind of a sense that the changes that you went through in terms of your own thinking were kind of unique to your path, or if there's just the way the world is changing has influenced how everybody thinks about it, or?
Yeah. Well, the seminary, when I entered the seminary, it was 1958, and that was kind of the high point of Catholicism in the United States. I mean, the seminary had to be expanded because there were so many seminarians. Well, as you know, now they can hardly get one or two if they're lucky. But it was a very vibrant time, and it was a very kind of triumphal time. It was the church triumphant. In other words, the Catholics were right, everybody else was wrong. You were raised in this thing. We were the elite corps in the seminary. You know, I went in the seminary because it was the ultimate calling for an Irish Catholic kid to be a priest. And it was kind of a Spartan image of riding off into the sunset like Shane, you know, and you're this hero and giving it all up for God. And I had no idea, of course, what I was giving up. I'd never, you know, I'd never hung out with girls and didn't know anything about celibacy, you know. But you're in the seminary with all these. Most of the seminary started when you were supposed to go in right out of the 8th grade. I went in 2 years later, but most of my classmates went in right out of the 8th grade. So at age 14, you're put in this system that's a lot like boot camp in the sense that, you're in lockdown basically. You can't read the newspaper, you can't watch TV, all your mail's censored. You're not allowed, big time, you're not allowed to go out with girls or have any contact with girls. So basically you're sexually and emotionally repressed from the time you're 14. And in my mind, that's kind of an explanation, perhaps, why at age 50, a lot of priests who've been repressed all their life, it's a pressure cooker, it's going to come out, and they're still emotionally 14 years old. So who are they drawn to? They're drawn to 14-year-old boys or, that type of thing. I mean, no one looks at the system that created this, I guess is my point. And I think they really need to look at that old Manichaean dualism of, sex is evil, the body is evil, suppress it, because it's at the base of a lot of problems that we have.
So let's move ahead then maybe to the next, I guess you could say chapter of your kind of awareness, like a next step that you documented. That wasn't necessarily less spiritual in nature, just a different kind of spirituality.
Yeah, it was all spiritual in the sense that I was gung-ho. I was the most committed person in the seminary in my mind, and perhaps so. I was really straight, very committed. And then in the 60s, when Pope John the 22nd became Pope and the Vatican Council happened, things opened up. So our reading got a little more expanded. We weren't allowed to read any book that wasn't given the official approval by the librarian before that. But I read a book called Honest to God, and it talked about God being out there and how that's impossible, because if God's infinite, God can't be separate from ourselves. And that really blew my mind. I really started thinking about things. And then I read a book on Martin Luther that was written by a non-Catholic, and I realized, Luther was a good guy. When he started out, he was totally right on. So all these little chinks in the armor. And then I went to Mississippi in '64 when I was still in the seminary, and was totally amazed at the situation down there. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And I became aware that the big problem was that those folks had no due process. Blacks in the South had absolutely no due process. They could be thrown in jail for nothing, no lawyer, anything. Well, I got back to the seminary and I realized we don't have any due process either. So all that kind of radicalized me, and I went through a very torturous decision of I worked in a parish for a while as a deacon, and I realized I could do it, but I really didn't believe in it anymore. I didn't believe in the church part of it. I still believed in some nebulous thing about the priesthood, devoting your life to God somehow or to spirituality, but it didn't gel with not believing in a church. So I left, and when I left, it was 1966. And I moved into what I thought was this quiet neighborhood called the Haight-Ashbury. And so then things took a different turn, although it seemed like a continuum, because it was a very spiritual time there. Everybody was searching, People were, marijuana was kind of a sacrament, and people were talking that would never have talked in the 50s, blacks and whites and rich and poor. It was all a melting pot there. And it felt like it was a continuation.
Maybe you could do a little bit of reading from
Sure.
it as a next
Yeah.
thing to do, and then I can ask you some of your artist process questions.
Sure,
and things.
sure. Well, just to give you an idea of some of the stuff that we were exposed to in the seminary first. So like every year we had this retreat at the beginning of the year. And so the retreat master was always someone that was, coming from the outside and telling us how we should live our lives. Father Ring is the spit-polished retreat master. Remember, men, you're preparing to become other Christs. You must die to yourselves by obedient submission to your superiors. He paces back and forth across the marble sanctuary, his shiny black shoes echoing dramatically in the high-ceilinged chapel, his black hair glistening in the shaft of morning light filtering through stained glass windows. A superior may err in commanding, but you can never err in obeying. Each day he hammers out a different theme, moving us toward his theatrical finale. On the last day, he stands in the middle of the sanctuary in silence, head bowed. Slowly, he looks up at us. Whenever you're tempted, men, and tempted you shall be, consider the consequences. Eternal hellfire, licking mercilessly at your raw, scorched, never decomposing flesh. Unbearable agony, gentlemen, unquenchable thirst. And for what? For one illicit pleasure, one prideful act, one momentary slip, you must endure the excruciating pain of hellfire for eternity. Not a sound in the chapel. Eternity, gentlemen, is a long time. Imagine if Mount Everest, the largest mountain in the world, were made of solid steel. And once a year, a tiny hummingbird flies by and ever so lightly brushes this mountain of steel with her wing. His voice goes deeper. His eyes burn, and a spiked finger drives each word into our pliant brains, shouting now, "Gentlemen, the length of time it would take that hummingbird to wear away Mount Everest, that is only the beginning of eternity." Absolute silence. No one moves. The retreat master bows his head, makes the sign of the cross, and walks toward the foot of the altar. 400 of us are riveted in our pews by images of flames and angry gods, steel mountains and scorched hummingbirds. No rules will be broken that day. So that was the retreat. Another thing, I talked about the whole thing about sex in the seminary. We had this biology teacher. We had one biology class, in college, and the teacher was Dr. Edward Philpott Mumford, who was an Anglican. So he was a non-Catholic. He was very worried about teaching in a Catholic seminary, and the rector had told him not to touch on evolution or anything like that. He studied etymology at Harvard and subsequently discovered a rare beetle, now known as the Mumford beetle. He teaches us biology in an old dark-paneled classroom that opens into a musty lab with stained beakers, pickled frogs, and an anatomical dummy missing its genitals. The doctor has a gray, wispy curls and a waddle that vibrates as he reads his notes at us. We constantly needle the gullible doctor about the dummy. "Doctor, the dummy doesn't seem to have any reproductive organs. Is that some sort of evolutionary anomaly?" Sighs the doctor, glancing nervously over his tortoise-shell glasses. "Father Wagner has asked me not to cover evolution in this class." We all groan our feigned disappointment. 5 years later, we will discover what happened to the missing genitals. In our last year in the seminary, just after we have taken the vow of celibacy, we will study a tract in moral theology entitled De Sexu, concerning sex. Here, for the first time, sexuality will be discussed. Father Fenn will arrive at class that day carrying a brown paper bag. He will reach inside the bag and pull out the genitals purloined from our hapless biology dummy. These will serve as props for his lecture on the morality of sex. Very few will remember the words of that lecture. Everyone will remember the props. So that was kind of the way sex was presented to us in the seminary. So you can imagine how hard it is once I leave the seminary and start having a normal life, trying to relate to girls. I had no clue.
Since then, it seems like you've had a series of successful relationships and...
Successful and not so successful. I mean, it's all a learning process.
I'd love to hear a little bit about some of that early transition into, was there a point where you said, I'm going to break this vow, and that's where I start? Or did the vow just get broken and then you went back and revisited?
No, actually, the vow of celibacy, by the time it was time for us to take the vow of celibacy, which we had about a year and a half before being ordained a priest at that point. Yeah. We had to come into the classroom and, take this oath. And by this time I didn't believe in celibacy. I didn't think it was a reasonable thing. I thought it should never have been a rule. So I went in and I didn't put my hand on the Bible, and I had my other fingers crossed, and I didn't say the words, I just mouthed them. So by the time I left, I was totally over any notion of celibacy, and I was very anxious to get into the game. But I realized I had no idea how to play the game. I mean, I'd never, gone through dating in high school, and it seemed like a very awkward and stilted kind of thing. But eventually, the other thing you have to remember is when you're in the seminary, you're constantly being bloated up on this pedestal as the representative of Jesus on earth. So you have this inflated sense of yourself and no ability really to connect with other people because you've been isolated the whole time. All the spirituality is geared toward breaking away from the world. You're not finding God through other people. You're finding God by going into church and praying and giving up, offering things up and that kind of stuff. So it's very hard when you're trying to relate to a woman when you're coming in with this priest facade, where you're used to going off by yourself when things get heavy and you're not used to treating another person, especially a woman, as an equal. So that was very difficult for me to get over that, and that took years. My first wife paid a lot of, I have to hand it to her for putting up with me as long as she did.
It's wild to think about now in some ways. I mean, because even all of your contemporaries at the school would have had this similar experience. I mean, it wasn't like you were having this experience and all of your friends were at high school dating and going through all those things.
Right.
It was completely...
Right. Yeah, we as a cohort, we all went through it. And now, that's why it's fun to go to reunions, because we look back and out of 120 guys that were in the seminary with me, there's only 8 that are still priests. And there were 14 ordained, and the others have all left and gotten married since being ordained. And before that, of course, a lot of guys dropped out, a lot of them because of celibacy, some just because, they didn't feel called to it. But when we talk, it's amazing, when we look back on it, just going, how did we ever believe that, first of all, and how did we get over it? How do we get out of it? That's the part I guess I want my kids to appreciate, just, how far I've come. I may be still screwed up, but it's been a long, long walk,
So where did this walk take you next? I mean, so you,
Well, yeah, after leaving the seminary, it was really hard because that was my career. I'd spent 9 years, and that was all I could imagine was being a priest. That's who I was. And so no other career really ever grabbed me that much. So I bounced around doing all sorts of stuff. And it was fun. I mean, I enjoyed it. Luckily, it kind of coincided with the Beatles in the 60s, where that was okay to bounce around and pick jobs for fun rather than for a career. So my resume looks a bit like a deli menu with all the, jobs listed on it, but it's been a very good ride, I guess I should tell you this part of the story. When I was a deacon, trying to decide whether to stay or not, and I was working in this parish, and all of a sudden it hit me, man, I've got a car at my disposal, 3 squares a day, living in this fancy rectory, which I really didn't agree with the luxury of the priest's house and everything. I said to God, whom I was just barely in contact still with, I said, this doesn't feel right being on top of the heap like this. I want to experience the bottom. Then maybe I'll be ready to be a priest. Well, you got to be careful what you pray for or ask for, because about 5 years to the day later, I ended up getting arrested in that same town, getting thrown in jail, getting beat up in jail, and I ended up on the bottom in that same town where I'd been a deacon preaching to these people. And so that's all in the book. And it's kind of a full circle. So I went through a divorce with my wife. Finally we separated, and then I just kind of hit the road for a long time. I was, let's see, there's one little part here I'll read you. I'll keep wandering for the next 5 years. I'll wander the rural towns of Colorado, settle briefly in Telluride as a freelance writer, interview Julie Christie at the first Telluride Film Festival. Then I'll hitchhike to Montana and jump freights through Washington and Oregon. I'll sleep in hobo jungles and learn how broken men pass their days without hope or expectation. I'll set chokers for a beer-drinking but born-again logger who curses and shakes his fist at heaven every time something breaks. I'll work as a security gardener in a dope patch, and then spend a year on a farm with an elderly couple who read books every night and have never seen a TV. I'll help a friend build a pyramid out of driftwood and pine logs, and spend a month with a spiritualist in Seattle who informs me that clouds are really just camouflage for Venetian spaceships. I'll deliver honey for a New Age beekeeper whose astrologer predicts my truck will break down in August. It does, and the mechanic tells me it's a problem with the planetary gears. I'll talk to the national president of the John Birch Society in Washington, D.C., and almost convince him that marijuana smokers should have the same rights as gun owners. I'll befriend dreadlocked radicals and bouffanted born-agains, alkies and teetotalers. I'll listen to their stories and fold their dueling conspiracy theories into an ever-expanding narrative that tries to embrace everything and everyone, no matter how crazy. I'll try to fill the hole that's been there since I left the seminary. I'll return to celibacy and imagine myself a Percival in search of the Holy Grail. But when my search is still unfulfilled, I'll lose patience and summon Jesus into one of my dreams. He'll appear before me with his maddeningly beatific smile. "You bastard," I say, "all my life you've been calling me to something, and I follow you down some pretty weird paths. But I'll be damned if I know what you want me to do." He smiles again, so I poke him hard in the chest. "I'm almost 50 years old, and I still don't know." He just nods, which pisses me off even more, so I jab him harder and get right in his face. "All I want's a little clarity, just a little frigging clarity." He stops smiling and puts his hands up, backing me off. Then he turns his head as though he's talking to somebody, his father, I assume, turns back and shrugs. "What can I say?" he says. "We need you under deep cover a little longer." So that made it a lot easier.
I mean, you touched on wanting to write this as kind of a documentation of what you went through for your kids to read, but obviously at some point it became more than just a stack of paper you were going to hand to them at some point. And we can talk a little bit about the process of this actually becoming a book. Yeah, at first it was really difficult to write because, like with many things in my life, I'd sit down all enthusiastic and spend a couple hours doing it, and then the next day try to sit down and it wouldn't come, and so then I'd start feeling guilty and blah, blah, blah. And then I had my second marriage, my stepson was taking piano lessons. And unlike my piano lessons back at St. Anselm's Grammar School, where Sister Mary and Gracia made me practice half an hour every day, and it was miserable, I would watch my stepson, and he would be watching TV, and then at the commercial, he'd go out and jump on the piano for about 3 minutes and just play around, just have fun, and then go back. He made it fun. So I started doing that with writing. I started, I'd sit down and have a glass of wine and just before dinner and start playing around with it. And pretty soon, I got to really get into it. And so that technique of making sure that it was pleasurable, and if it stopped being pleasurable, I had permission to stop, It seemed to carry me through. And then after a while, it became a habit. And then I really got more involved in it. And
it eventually happened. So, and I had some great help from Suzanne Kingsbury. Having her as an editor was like taking a course in creative writing. I'd taken a lot of writing courses, but never one in creative writing, and so it was very helpful to have her perspective about showing, not telling, and things like that. So that helped a lot.
I note some other sticky note markings here.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
Here a little more.
How about, I think we'll do one on the, when I was in Mississippi, two of us went down there, my friend Bob and I, and I was just amazed. I mean, I'd grown up in California and had never experienced anything like that. This was 1964. So later that week, I drive a group of teenage boys to a workshop. The old truck's steering is loose, veering first to one side, then the other, so I'm concentrating on the road, and I don't notice the bright yellow Impala coming up behind me till it pulls in next to me and honks. Two men are leaning out the windows, waving their middle fingers at me. "Hey, nigger lover, pull over." I push down the accelerator and get ahead of them, straddling the white line so they can't get around. In the rear-view mirror, I count 5 of them, all in their 30s or 40s. The kids are yelling now, flipping them off. We haven't learned any nonviolent strategies for this kind of situation. I start praying, yelling, really. "Lord, help us, damn it! Show me what to do!" I look in the mirror just in time to see one of my kids holding up an empty Coke bottle. He waves it at the Impala, then launches it in a graceful arc. I see smoke erupt from under the Impala's tires as it dips forward into a violent skid. The bottle shatters on the asphalt just in front of it. Oh shit, we're really screwed now. I jam the accelerator to the floor and glance again at the mirror, expecting to see the Impala roaring up on us. Instead, it starts growing smaller in the distance. Then it turns around and heads off in the other direction. I gulp air. Whew. Thanks, Lord, for that clarification. Communication trumps principle. Nonviolence didn't impress those guys, but that Coke bottle sure did. So then after that, we got this warning that the Klan was going to bomb our house. So we vacated the place for the weekend, because that's when they usually did their maneuvers, when they were out drinking on the weekend. So we came back that next Saturday morning after spending all night at a black little jukebox place where you dance all night. And we took a nap, you know, and okay. I wake up around 10 a.m. after dreaming about the Impala and the Coke bottle. Something stirs in my consciousness, a plan. I get up quickly, careful not to wake the others, the other 2 guys that were with me, and head downtown. The hardware store is bustling. Lots of pickups parked out front. The old screen door squeaks when I push it open. There are customers by the counter with soda bottles in their hand. A few are over at the tool rack. And this is in Mississippi, where somehow everybody in this little town, all the whites, knew that we were there as, quote, freedom riders. So everyone turns when the door slams shut behind me. The store goes completely silent. All their eyes are on me. Behind the counter, the man at the cash register straightens and clears his throat. "Can I help you?" His tone is mocking. My heart is beating wildly. I cross the floor in slow, deliberate steps. I look at the cashier. He's tall and bald, and his Adam's apple goes up and down in a slow swallow. I say loudly, "I'd like a box of 22 shells, please." His eyes open wide. Then he catches himself, turns around, and slowly reaches for a box of shells. "That'll be $2.59. I lay 3 bills on the counter. "Thank you." I can feel all the eyes on me. I collect my change and walk back to the door, doing my best gunfighter swagger, a skinny John Wayne with thinning hair and glasses. So that actually worked. They backed off because they thought maybe we weren't going to be nonviolent. My friend Bob was very upset about that. He said I'd violated the principles of nonviolence. I said, no, because I remembered the kids in the car. It's all part of kind of getting over that living in your head about things, you know, and getting a little more practical about life. So I told you I was troubled when I became a deacon about we had this bishop. It was a new diocese in Santa Rosa, and he had just been made bishop, and he decided he was going to refurbish everything in the diocese. So he started this building campaign, and he was, building new churches, sprucing up all the priests' houses. It was just awful, I thought. Anyway, it was really bothering me. So he invited my friend Jim and myself, who were deacons, to his house for the priests get-together. He had a big party for the priests. And so we went, and there was a big dinner and everything. After dinner, Jim and I walk out on the porch. The sun has disappeared except for a glowing rim on the distant hills to the east. Jim pats his stomach. Boy, Mac, that was good. Well, my soon-to-be deacons, we turn around and see the bishop and Jerry Cox, his chancellor. Both are dressed in black suits and clerical collars. The bishop wears a large gold cross around his neck. He smiles and shakes hands. What do you think of this place? This was the bishop's mansion that he had just bought. It's beautiful, Jim says. Bishop Maher cocks his head toward me. And you, Greg, how are you doing? He has a fatherly smile. Actually, Bishop, there is something that's been bothering me. Oh? His forehead creases slightly. I mean, I know we don't take an actual vow of poverty, but I'm having trouble reconciling the spirit of poverty with your building program. I want to confess to him, to have him understand my dilemma. I want him to spiritually reassure me. Greg, you don't understand anything. His face is suddenly flushed. His lips are pinched. We have to show the people of Santa Rosa that the Catholic Church is not a fly-by-night institution. He thrusts his pectoral cross in my face. It's here to stay. He sweeps his arms toward the dining room. That's why I bought this house. Do you know who my neighbors are? He spins me around and points down the hill, naming off bank presidents, winery owners, judges. I hold up my hands. Okay, Bishop, okay. Breathing hard, he centers his cross on his chest. Then he turns abruptly away. Monsignor Cox glances at Jim, shrugs his big shoulders, and follows him out. Jim shakes his head. Geez, Mac, you seem to have found Leo's hot button. So that was my basic turnaround, I think, where I realized I just can't do this. It's a good old boys club, and it's not going to change. Up to that time, I was kind of naively thinking, they're going to change the vow of celibacy any day now. The Vatican Council has opened up all these things, but it wasn't happening. They were starting to turn it backwards even then.
So what happened next? What was we got a little preview of it with the 5 years later, but what was kind of the first step?
The next thing was I moved to San Francisco, like I say, to the Haight-Ashbury. I could read you that. That was a big shift.
So did you have to resign?
You had to. Yeah. I went to the bishop and told him I was leaving, and he said, "Well, Greg, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'll get a job. I have to get a job." And he says, "Good. That's what you need to do. Get a job. Trouble with you is you think too much." So I did. I got a job, and then I went to San Francisco State. And so then that next year, I'm going to San Francisco State, and my classmates, that was when my classmates got ordained, So I went to the ordination. The fog creeps over Twin Peaks as I drive my 59 Bug from our apartment in the Haight-Ashbury to St. Paul's Church. My heart's beating fast as I slide into a rear pew. It's been almost a year since I've been in a church, and it feels cold, strange. The scent of incense and the glow of candles that once comforted me now feel like symbols of oppression. Could be me up there, waiting with my robed classmates to walk down the stone aisle. Instead, I'm getting a master's degree in creative arts interdisciplinary studies at San Francisco State and living down the street from the Grateful Dead. The organ thunders a prelude. Everyone rises and turns toward the rear as the choir breaks into song. I watch the hierarchy of males stream up the center aisle, First the well-scrubbed, pink-cheeked altar boys carrying candles and a tall crucifix. Then a phalanx of seminarians dripping propriety and symmetry. Then my classmates, the honored ones, dressed in white albs, some smiling and looking around, others with downcast, pious eyes. After them a long column of priests of every size and shape, many giving officious nods to their friends in the pews. Next come the bishops in their red robes, mitres perched on balding, white-haired heads. Finally the archbishop himself enters, holding his staff in his left hand, blessing the crowd with his right. The organ thunders on, and I wonder what my old classmates would think of my life now, what they would say to my roommates in the Haight, how they would act in my graduate seminars. Last week we had to go around the room and describe our master's projects. Ralph said he was experimenting with noise, John Cage, that kind of stuff. Everyone except for me seemed to know who John Cage was. A chubby woman with chopped blonde hair gave each of us her Nazi psychologist look and said, "I intend to use Esalen encounter techniques to liberate creativity." Everyone waited for her to say something else, and when she didn't, Fred, an ex-monk in a dashiki, finally said, "Far out, that sounds great." I plan to explore Hermann Hesse's bead game. I know who Hesse is. I've even read Siddhartha, but I've never heard of any bead game. When it's my turn, I look around at the 9 other faces, so passionate about art, music, witchcraft, psychotherapy. I'm not sure yet, I told them, but I think I want to write something about God, humor, and creativity. They all gave me blank looks. Finally, Dashiki Fred said, "Far out." The procession has now reached the altar, and the choir intones the Litany of Saints. My classmates prostrate themselves on the sanctuary floor before the Archbishop. I wonder if they're as distracted by the dust motes on the floor as I was last year when I was ordained a deacon. Stroking my new beard, I imagine what Jesus would think of all the pomp on the altar. He probably would have run most of these guys out of the temple and then gone out to hang with the prostitutes and sinners. My mind wanders to Susanna, sitting at the edge of the circle in my graduate seminar, her pale blue eyes framed by delicate lines, dark hair spilling over her bare shoulders. She has tanned legs crossed, a sandal dangling from her bare foot. "I'm a dancer," she says in that feathery voice, "and I'm working with the bioenergetic theories of Wilhelm Reich and Fritz Perls." I can't take my eyes off her. She intrigues and scares me. The woman sitting next to me in the pew pulls a lace handkerchief out of her purse and wipes her eyes. My classmates are still lying prostrate. When I gave Susanna a ride home from class, she said, "I'm performing this weekend. Do you want to come?" On the altar, the bishops sit stiffly in their chairs, and I think about Susanna and those 2 male dancers performing totally nude in the little warehouse studio, her lithe body slithered in and out of theirs like a snake. Is Susanna the kind of woman Bishop Maher warned me about? Bishop Maher told me that I should not go to San Francisco State because I wouldn't find the kind of woman there that I should find. After the dance performance, she gave me a copy of Wilhelm Reich's The Murder of Christ. According to Reich, Jesus was sexually free, uncontaminated by the emotional plague that afflicts humankind and chokes off the basic sexual energy of life. They killed him because they found his freedom too threatening. My classmates stand in line before the Archbishop, pledging him their obedience. I imagine myself up there between Len Duggan and Jim McDonald, my mom sitting in the front pew watching her perfect son ordained. Only a year ago, I was standing on the altar with Jim Pulskamp wearing the same white alb, being ordained a deacon. Now I go to anti-war marches and hang out with a nude dancer who thinks they killed Jesus because he was sexually liberated. It's a different brand of priesthood. The woman next to me dabs her eyes again. She has no idea she's sitting next to a guerrilla priest who was called by Jesus away from organized religion. The woman looks over at me and smiles. Her lace collar and dainty gloves remind me of my grandmother. I smile back. I'm hoping people will see this book as a kind of a journey that I think many people have taken, where you start out and as a young person, things are very clear, good and bad, black and white. And then things get a little fuzzier, and then you reach a whole other place in your life where things are radically different. And for me, that change came through a pretty dramatic events, it wasn't easy. I think because I was so programmed into the old that coming into the new really was a fracture. And so I think anybody that's gone through any kind of change would enjoy the book. I hope so. And you can get it you can go to my website, which is http://gregorymcallister.com, and that'll tell you how to do it. Or you can just order it straight from Amazon, Salvation of a Serial Celibate.